let's spend a few minutes anyway talking about actual government in action with actual policies and potential controversies instead of government in corruption and dereliction. So, pretty big news this week. The federal student loan forgiveness. Biden announced his plan. We're told he really ruminated about the figure. We've heard some interesting cross currents on both sides of the aisle. Let me cut to the chase of a very provocative tweet from one David Jolley. The likelihood of this dramatically backfiring on Biden is unfortunately very, very high. Not just high, but very, very high. David, what are you thinking?
So, very importantly, I don't actually have a personal opinion on this. I tried to lose all personal opinions when I left Congress. This is just a political, study. And here's how I would frame it. The Biden administration is coming off a summer of very low risk, high reward legislative wins, from guns to a minimum corporate tax to Medicare negotiating price controls for prescriptions, to capping out-of-pocket prescription costs, and low risk, high reward. Recognize Republicans are not really beating up the Biden administration over any of those legislative victories because they can't. They can't say corporations should be taxed less. We need higher drug prices. We need more gun violence, right? This is a big summer for Joe Biden. And what I would suggest he did in the move this week on student debt is he grabbed a low reward, high risk proposition. And what he actually did is he handed Republicans a lightning rod. You can defend what he did, certainly on moral grounds. I know a lot of people say this is life-changing, and it certainly is for beneficiaries of that. But what he did do was light a divide in the country where there hadn't been one. And he handed Republicans a very powerful issue. So look, my tweet is that there is a high likelihood this backfires. That's not to say there is. I certainly could be proven wrong. But what I would suggest is the Biden administration just took on an incredibly divisive issue this week that is going to evoke strong passions on both sides of the issue going into November.
I would just say that I don't agree with the policy. I think we send a wrong message by, for example, not requiring that they pay back something. Many people had a debt that was less than $10,000, or if they had a $20,000, that we should have encouraged people to at least pay something. But as a political matter, the White House was loaded for bear and ready for this. And what we saw in the last 24 hours was them coming back with the information on loans, giant loans that had been forgiven, that had been given to Republican congressmen as part of the PPP. And of course, as part of PPP, some very large corporations were forgiven their loans. And the argument was essentially, well, if you're going to do it for them, why not do it for these people? My answer is you shouldn't do it for anybody. People should repay their debts, but that's me. And I think what he did there was kind of dilute or deter Republicans' willingness to be quite so out there on this. I don't think it'll stop them, but to be quite out there. I would also say, as a political matter, for my conversations with the White House, the Democratic Party is a big old coalition, and they have to keep this people happy and those people happy. They had to keep moderates happy. They had to win over Joe Manchin to get a bill through. And this is a little bit of keeping the group together kind of stuff. There were many in the party who wanted to wipe out $50,000 worth of debt. The NAACP and unions were threatening to go out and campaign against Biden if they didn't do some of this. So some of the stuff you do in government is simply a political compromise. And I don't think that had he not had that pressure internally, he would have done that, frankly, because I think his initial inclination, which was the right one, was working class people don't like this. More people in America do not go to college than do, by a lot. And
they're mostly Trump voters, especially. There was also a racial dynamic here. Yeah,
exactly. So I would say one thing, it's sometimes better to be lucky than good, because what's the news for the next few days? Mar-a-Lago. So once more, Trump screws the Republicans by taking the attention from something that might help them and directing it back to himself.
So let me add a few points. The one thing I wish Biden had done in addition to this is to call out the scam of higher education,
Yes.
which is the sky-high tuition rates. Lots of people pay a lot less than the manufacturer's suggested retail price. Part of the reason that tuition is so high is that we have so many more administrators, deans and assistant deans, and we need to overhaul the system entirely. I never had a student loan, but that's because I'm old. And I went to a state school. When I went to the University of Minnesota, believe it or not, the tuition when I started was $85 a quarter. In other words, $255 a year. It went up in my senior year to $125 a quarter. We were outraged. Think about that, $375, no matter what you do with inflation, that is a pittance compared to what there is now. I had a minimum wage job, $1.25 an hour, and I paid my tuition and my books and my costs. So he should have done that. But as Jen said, he had to do something on this front. And we have to keep in mind that for a large number of people, the debt that they have been saddled with, made much greater, frankly, because in the Trump administration, the Secretary of Education let big banks raise interest rates for these student loans, and that's not a new thing, beyond what they used to be. As I recall, my wife had a small loan from Yale Law School, but it was like at 2% or 3% interest. You've got some of these kids who've had to pay 12 or 15%. One of the things that it's done is people coming out of college or graduate school can't go into a public interest job, can't go work for a nonprofit because they can't afford to pay back the loans. So this was something that needed an overhaul. It still needs an overhaul. But among all the issues we have out there heading towards November, David, I'm just skeptical that this is going to keep an outrage level up enough that it will make a difference in terms of the votes cast. And you're right, it created a big divide.
I agree with you. I think it will be in most Republican campaign commercials this fall because they're speaking to Republican voters, right? And they're going to drive this wedge.
Yeah.
And Norm, I'm glad you brought up the comprehensive reform because the opportunity missed here for the Biden administration was to actually wrap this in a comprehensive reform package. They did some things. They did we're going to cap it at 5% of your income, your repayment levels and so forth. But here's a perfect example. Student loan does not have available to it the same ability to reorganize and restructure in bankruptcy court, right? Because of the moral hazard argument, the law does not allow that. Well, guess what? Why don't we rewrite the law and trust bankruptcy judges to say, if you can no longer make payments based on financial conditions, you're eligible for reorganization. The other thing is the law of unintended consequences. In the 90s, when the Clinton administration came in and said, we are going to bring the government into the lending business and underwriting loans and take the universities out of it so that more people can go to college, good public policy. What it did is it gave the university system a free ride. They get paid up front, but unless the default rate of their graduates exceeds 16 or 18%, they don't care if their graduates actually earn enough money to pay back the loans. They've already been paid. So what if we actually tied remuneration to the universities to the performance of their graduates' loans? Now you're talking about real dramatic reform in American higher education. That's not this. This is actually going to be this economic wedge issue going into November that Republicans are happy to grab onto.
Good.
And that's not even considering the separate scandal of for-profit colleges, which are
That's
the source
exactly
of
right.
half the defaults here.
The explanation that David Jolly just gave is a perfect example of what we are missing by having a non-functional Republican crazy pants party. That there is no one there to make these very sane, actually conservative arguments. The arguments they make have nothing to do with conservatism, but which actually look at things like moral hazard, which actually look at reform, which actually look at unintended consequences. These were the things that David and I used to propound when we were both, well within the mainstream of the Republican Party. There's no David Jollies left, and it's not like there are people out there who want to, rearrange the furniture. They're burning down down the House. So this is what we lose when one party goes completely off the deep end. There's no real discipline for the party that's left, and we lose a smart component of public policy.
Yeah, it's a stunningly good point. I mean, the Republican Party is just no longer the party of ideas, which it really was for a couple decades.